Well, hello everyone. My name is Omar Kashat. I'm an adult services librarian here at the Carroll Stream Public Library, and I'm definitely a big, huge Star Trek fan. So thank you for coming out this evening as we'll be learning all about Star Trek and the 90s, which is why today's program is called Star Trek, A Journey Through the 90s, and we will boldly flow from one year to the next. All right, well, I'm going to turn off my camera here real quick, and then we'll just go ahead and get started. All right, so I like to think of the 1990s as Star Trek's golden decade because in the 1990s, there were three ongoing series. What were they? Well, the first one was Star Trek The Next Generation, which ran from 1987 to 1994. After that, we had Star Trek Deep Space Nine from 1993 to 1999. And then finally, we had Star Trek Voyager, which ran from 1995 to 2001. But in addition to three ongoing series, we also had four movies in the 90s. The first one was Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country in 1991, the final send-off for the original series crew. After that, we had Star Trek Generations in 1994, which was the first of the Next Generation films, followed by two others, Star Trek First Contact in 1996 and Star Trek Insurrection in 1998. As I said, there was a lot of Star Trek going on in the 90s. Plus, there was everything else. Of course, we're talking about the books, the toys, and the video games. Now, well, today we'll mostly be talking about the shows and the movies. We'll also highlight a little bit about the books, the toys, and the video games as well. So you're probably also thinking to yourself, well, Omar, what's really going on here? This is not logical. Why are we celebrating the 90s in 2022? This isn't an anniversary year. I mean, it is for the Next Generation, but that started in 1987, although it did go into the 90s. So what's going on? Well, what Star Trek movie celebrated its 30th anniversary in December 2021? Well, if you've been paying attention to a couple slides ago, you would realize that that was Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, which came out in 1991, celebrated its 30th anniversary. Although, in addition to 1991 being the year Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country came out, it was also Star Trek's 25th anniversary, and they had a number of celebrations in that regard. Which also means that 2021 was also Star Trek's 55th anniversary. So I really meant to be doing this program last month in December, or back in, actually now it was 2 months ago in December. It just I didn't get around till now. So we're celebrating the 90s rather than my original plan was just to celebrate 1991. So to that I say do. And this was the logo that they had for 55 years of Star Trek. Looks really nice. That's the original Enterprise there on the back. And it was just, yeah, really nice. I don't think they really did too much for the anniversary last year, but hey, you know what? We got Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Lower Decks, and even Star Trek Prodigy. And I think also Star Trek Picard also aired last year, if not the year prior. So you know what? We're in good hands. There's a lot of Star Trek to be had on Paramount Plus. I won't show this, but this was just a fun little clip from The Simpsons for one of their couch gags where they blew up a couch in their Enterprise starship where the saucer section was shaped like a donut, and then a bunch of couches turned around and fired right back at them and blew them up. But moving on, you're probably saying to yourself, well, Omar, you said you're a Star Trek fan, but we're going to talk about like 10 years. Do you really have all of this memorized? And then I say, well, I'll be honest with you, I don't. I went to Memory Alpha. Memory Alpha was the library planet in the Star Trek universe. It was the Federation kept all of their information and knowledge there on computers, and that was featured in an original series episode. But no, I didn't go to Memory Alpha, the planet, but I did go to Memory Alpha, the wiki. Memory Alpha is a Wikipedia-like website that has a little over 50,000 Star Trek articles. And I went from year to year picking out the stuff that I found the most interesting. So while this will not be a comprehensive review of everything that happened each year, it will have some highlights that I thought were the most interesting. But just know, because it's a wiki, sometimes they get things wrong. I'm reasonably confident that all the dates for the episodes are correct, although I did find one thing wrong about when they claimed the first Star Trek DVD came out. But that's why I tried to do my own research when I could. So yes, but I still encourage you to use Memory Alpha if you can. They're a fun website. They got a lot of Star Trek articles. It's just fun to reminisce about episodes, ships, crew members, so on and so forth. So let's begin by going straight off into warp. In the year 1990, on February 9th, we had Deja Q. That was the episode where Q, who was an omnipotent entity who likes to cause problems for the Enterprise D and her crew, he lost his powers. And so he was made human. His species made him human to teach him a lesson. So they dumped him on the Enterprise, and the Enterprise had to deal with Q, the human, as well as have to deal with an alien race that was fed up with Q and wanted to get rid of him. Interestingly enough, the idea that Q would lose his powers was something that had actually been explored about a year or two earlier in the Star Trek comics, Next Generation comics, which was done by DC Comics in those days. So I guess the idea of Q losing his powers was just too good of an idea that everyone thought of, both the comics and the people writing the episodes. Although I don't believe Deja Q was inspired by that plot line, but still, it's interesting to hear that this plot got used twice. February 19th, we definitely had a Dynamo, a well-regarded episode of yesterday's Enterprise, certainly one of the highlights of Star Trek: The Next Generation, as well as Star Trek as a whole. If you're not familiar with the Next Generation, it features the crew of the Enterprise D. Well, what happened to yesterday's Enterprise was the Enterprise C, which was the predecessor to the Enterprise D, came through a time rift. And because it came through a time rift, well, suddenly the future changed, where our peaceful, happy crew of the Enterprise D are now suddenly finding themselves in a war with the Klingons. And they're all completely they're different from their original appearances and the way they used to act, because now the Federation, which was at peace with the Klingons, is now at war with the Klingons. And we find out the reason why is spoilers. The Enterprise C was not supposed to have gone into the future. It was supposed to have blown up in the past, saving a Klingon colony. But because the Enterprise C didn't do that, the future changed. And so now the crew of the Enterprise D are left in a little bit of a conundrum, where do they send the Enterprise C into the past to be destroyed and her crew into the past to be destroyed, or do they keep her in the future where the Enterprise C is not destroyed, but now millions of other people have died because the war existed when it wasn't supposed to, and their little dilemma there. And that's really the crux of the episode. Again, very well done, very highly recommended as well as regarded. On March 19th, we had Sins of the Father. Sins of the Father was a Worf episode. Worf is the member of the Enterprise crew who is a Klingon. Well, when he was a child, his parents were killed at an outpost called Kittimer, and Worf was the only survivor. Well, it turns out that down the road, the Klingons are going to blame his father for the people who attacked the outpost. They were called the Romulans. They were going to blame his father for letting the Romulans destroy the outpost. Well, Worf knew that wasn't true. So he went back to his home planet to figure out what was going on. And there's a lot of political intrigue involved, and really, really helped to flesh out the Klingon characters for the first time, since before they were usually just your generic baddies for some of the original series era. April 30th, we had Hollow Pursuits. The only thing really to say about that is that was the first appearance of Reginald Barclay. Reginald Barclay was a neurotic engineer who had a case of he was not very high on self-confidence. He was definitely a worrier, but we all loved him the same. He was played by Dwight Schultz, and he would appear regularly throughout the Next Generation as well as Star Trek Voyager. May 14th, we had Sarek, which was the first overt appearance of a TOS character, the original series character, in the Next Generation. Up until this point, I mean, aside from a brief cameo of DeForest Kelley as Admiral McCoy, even though he was never referred to that in the pilot episode, although it was obviously him, there were really no linkage between the first couple seasons of the Next Generation back to the original series. Well, this ended that. Sarek was Spock's father. He had appeared in the original series, he appeared in the movies, and now he appeared here. And so that was really the first, major piece of continuity, aside from the DeForest Kelley cameo in the pilot, linking these two series together. June 18th. We had the end of season 3, which was the Best of Both Worlds, part 1. Certainly that is another well-regarded episode of Star Trek. If you're not familiar with the Borg are a race of cyborgs who want to assimilate people into their collective. Well, they abducted with Captain Picard and they assimilated him. And this episode had one of the most well-known climaxes in Star Trek history, if not television as well, where Commander Riker is now in charge of the Enterprise. They know Captain Picard has been assimilated. He's on the Borg cube, and Commander Riker tells Mr. Lieutenant Worf to fire their special secret weapon on the Borg cube. And he basically says, Mr. Worf, fire, and then goes straight to be continued. Oh, what a cliffhanger. You had to wait till September 24th for the start of season 4, which is the Best of Both Worlds part 2, to figure out, well, what happened after that? Did the Enterprise succeed? Did they blow up the Borg cube? Is Patrick Stewart leaving the show? Is Elizabeth Dennehy, who was a guest character on the Best of Both Worlds part 1, is now she going to be the first officer? Is Jonathan Frakes now going to be the captain? I mean, it was an agonizing multiple month wait, but everything went back. Everything worked out. The captain was saved. The Borg were stopped, and everything went back to normal by the next episode. And then on November 13th, we had Final Mission. That was where Wesley Crusher, bid his farewells. That was it for Wil Wheaton. Wil Wheaton had been a regular on the series up until this point, but he left to go pursue other opportunities in film. And I liked Wil Wheaton. My issues with Wesley are mainly just the way he was written. He was written to be so smart that he was smarter than the crew in the early seasons, but by this point they gotten away from that. But I think he really should have been an ensign and had his own group of friends, and then had separate storylines if possible. But like I said, I liked Wil Wheaton. We actually did this presentation earlier this week, and there were also some people who had attended live who had also really, really liked Wesley. So I don't hate Wesley. They don't hate Wesley. We don't hate Wesley. So if Wil Wheaton, if you're ever watching this someday, I hope that lets you know that there are people out there who still love Wesley. All right. So what was the highlight of this season? I would give it up to yesterday's Enterprise. I really liked this episode. I already said what the plot was, but I just think it's such a well done episode. The way it's shot, the way the cast are able to sort of turn into these new characters who are just slightly different from the ones they've been portraying up until this point. And having the Enterprise C come through time and we learn about them and their crew was just, really well done. I mean, there's more to that episode, which I won't go into, but again, a real strong performances across the board, I thought. And so that's why this is my favorite episode of this year, as well as, Star Trek in general. Moving on to 1991, as we said much at the beginning of the presentation, this was Star Trek's 25th anniversary. On January 28th, we had The Wounded, which was the first appearance of the Cardassians, a lizard-like species that was an alien, sort of a antagonist to the Federation, who we'd never heard of up until this point. The Cardassians will later play a major role in the upcoming Star Trek Deep Space Nine in a couple years. However, Deep Space Nine was not even thought of at this point, so the Cardassians were introduced, but they were not introduced with the idea of appearing later on in Deep Space Nine. It's just things worked out that way, where they were a major player in that show. On February 11th, we had Clues. I like this episode. Basically, the crew of the Enterprise D explores a wormhole, and they're knocked unconscious, and then they wake back up. And while they thought that only a few minutes had passed, they slowly start to realize that, in fact, more time had passed, and they'd actually been awake during whatever that missing time was. Meanwhile, Data's acting all erratic, so they're trying to figure out what's going on, and they're searching for clues, hence the name of the episode. On April 16th, shooting actually began on Star Trek VI. This kind of surprised me that they were able to shoot this movie and have it come out in the same year. It usually takes a year or two for movies to come out from when they're first made, but hey, I'm not complaining. April 22nd, a fun one, Cupid. Cupid had Q come back. He had his powers now, and he basically challenged Captain Picard to test his love for a character who had shown up in a previous episode. Her name was Vash. She was sort of Captain Picard's love interest. And in order to challenge his notions of love, he turned the Enterprise crew into Robin Hood and his merry men. Q became the sheriff in Nottingham, and Vash became Maid Marian. And the fun part was Worf, being the Klingon, was none too happy to be there. As he famously proclaimed, he said, "Sir, I protest. I am not a merry man." And then he broke Geordi's lute. And anyway, it's a pretty silly episode, but it's a fun episode. So not all Star Trek has to be serious. You can have some goofy stuff. And I need to really get back to this episode. I haven't seen it in a long time. Book-wise, on May 1st, we had Star Trek The Next Generation Vendetta was published. If you're not familiar with the books were able to explore plot lines that the TV show never did. Vendetta was one of the first large novels that I ever read as a kid, and it basically featured by Peter David. And it was fun because the Enterprise crew came up against another planet killer. The planet killer we'd seen in the original series. Well, this was another planet killer, and they had to stop it and figure out why was the planet killer here and what was it up to. So that was a fun one. On June 17th and September 23rd, Redemption 1 and 2 airs. This was the season 4 finale leading into the season 5 premiere. Redemption 1 has the honor of being the 100th episode of The Next Generation, which is certainly a big accomplishment. The original series only went for 79 episodes. This basically featured a Klingon civil war. And the Federation is trying to figure out why the Klingons suddenly split in two. Are the Romulans involved, and what can they do without getting involved in the Civil War to hopefully see that the group that's more friendly to the Federation and not being propped up by the Romulans is assuming winning the war. I kind of wish the series that had gone on longer, this Klingon Civil War, but it was wrapped up in 2 episodes. September 30th, we had a dynamo of an episode, another well-regarded episode, Darmok, or as the famous saying goes in that episode, Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra. This was an episode that's used by linguists in college and universities a lot to explain, how language works, because the Darmok, or not Darmok, but in this episode, an alien captain kidnaps Captain Picard and takes him to the surface of a planet, and he communicates effectively in what are memes, as someone had pointed out during the presentation when we had it earlier this week. That's what they talk about. They talk in memes. They don't say like, "Hello, how are you doing?" or like, "We're going to go do this." They say an experience in their culture as a way to communicate. And that's basically what the whole episode is this captain desperately trying to establish a dialogue with Captain Picard to let the Federation understand their language and make it so that they are able to communicate. And it's just such a well done episode. Paul Winfield, who played Captain Terrell in Star Trek II, was in this episode as the captain. And it's just, like I said, it's just well regarded. It's definitely regarded as one of Star Trek's best. On October 7th, we had Ensign Ro. Ensign Ro featured a new semi-regular character played by Michelle Forbes. She played a character called Ro Laren. She was a Bajoran, and this episode was the first appearance of the Bajorans. And again, we're talking before this. Again, Deep Space Nine was just, if it was anything at this point, it was just a vague idea. They certainly did not introduce the Bajorans with the intention of having them on Deep Space Nine, although it definitely did work out that way. And in fact, the Bajorans weren't even, from what I read, is the Bajorans weren't even supposed to have been oppressed by the Cardassians. They were actually oppressed by the Romulans, but I guess by this point, the writers didn't want to use the Romulans anymore, or at least felt they were overusing them. And so the Cardassians were the ones who were oppressing them and had basically occupied their planet. And then, of course, as for you Deep Space Nine fans, you know that this basically is something that would continue throughout all 7 seasons of Deep Space Nine, dealing with the Cardassians and the Bajorans, and of course the Jem'Hadar and the Dominion. We'll get to that. Sad note, though, on October 24th, Gene Roddenberry passed away. They had a funeral for him, and they named actually a Star Trek soundstage after him on the Paramount lot called the Gene Roddenberry stage, or lot, or something. Regardless, they named a stage after him. November 4th and November 11th was Unification Parts 1 and 2. And this was a big one because Leonard Nimoy came back as Spock. He portrayed Spock in these 2 episodes. And it was just fun to see the Enterprise crew encounter Captain Spock again, or for the first time, I should say, after he'd been talked a little bit about in Sarek. And it's just such a good episode. In fact, the seeds of this will later be seen in the 2009 Star Trek movie with Chris Pine and everyone else. Because in this one, Spock goes to Romulus, the home of the Romulans, who are basically the enemies of the Federation, and the Federation can't figure out why. And then they later find out that Spock wants to reunify his peoples because the Romulans and the Vulcans were both, they're both the same species. They started out as one alien race, and then the Vulcans embraced logic and the Romulans embraced their emotions, so they went their separate ways. And so in this episode, he's trying to reunify them. And like I said, this has repercussions sort of later on in the movies. But anyway, and then also in Star Trek Discovery, where spoilers, we find out that in the future, the Romulans and the Vulcans were able to reunify. So on December 6th, of course, we had Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. This is very heavy in its Cold War parallels, but basically this sets the stage for how, because we knew in the Next Generation that the Federation, the Klingons, had achieved peace. Well, in this movie, we figure out why. And in fact, it features a fun cameo from Michael Dorn as playing Worf, who is not the Worf from the Next Generation. He plays Worf, who is the Worf from the Next Generation's grandfather. He played Colonel Worf in this movie. So what was the highlight of this year? I'm going to give it up to Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. I thought this was such a well-done movie, sorry. This was such a well-done movie. It really gave the Enterprise crew of the original series. I think they got an excellent send-off, and it featured a very cunning villain in the form of Christopher Plummer as Chang, and David Warner had a good turn as Chancellor. I just had his name a minute ago. Gorkon. He played Chancellor Gorkon, who was desperate to achieve peace between the Federation and the Klingons, because otherwise the Klingons empire was going to die because of an accident that happened on their on the Klingon moon of Praxis. So yeah, if you haven't seen this one, please by all means do. Very well done, very tense, definitely a political thriller, but also has a lot of action too. It also gave us this really good teaser for that too, where it showed highlights of the crew of the Enterprise, which I'm not going to show, but just look up Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country official teaser on YouTube, and you should be able to find it. So 1992 now. On February 17th, we had Conundrum. I was a big fan of this episode. This was kind of funny, the fun, but also serious, but mostly fun, where the Enterprise crew of the Enterprise D, they lose their memories. And so basically it has this fun sequence where Worf assumes that he's captain of the Enterprise. Data thinks he's a bartender, and Captain Picard is now manning the helm. He's piloting the ship. They eventually are able to access the computer and they figure out who they're supposed to be. However, there is now a new member of the crew who we've never seen before, who is now telling that the Enterprise crew that they were at war with another alien species and they have to go destroy them. And there's a lot of tension involved. Again, as the Enterprise crew, they don't have their memories back, but their computer and this new crew member says they're supposed to attack this alien race. And the question is, are they going to go through with it or not? And why is this, and what is really going on here? Why does this new crew member want them to destroy an alien race? March 23rd, we had Cause and Effect. This had a very interesting opening. The Enterprise is severely damaged, and it explodes before the credits. And not only that, it explodes multiple times throughout this episode because the crew is caught in a temporal causality loop. And basically what happens is every time the Enterprise blows up, they get reset into the past, and slowly they start to remember what was happening in the previous loops. And now they're trying to figure out, how are we going to get out of this? How are we not going to be destroyed? So that's really the tension of the episode. March 30th, we had The First Duty. Will Wheaton came back in a one-off episode where he was a member of a crew of cadets at Starfleet Academy, and one of their fellow cadets had been killed. And there's a big investigation into what happened. Now, an actor was in this movie playing a character called Nick Locarno, and that was Robert Duncan McNeil. Robert Duncan McNeil would come to prominence in another few years when he played Tom Paris, who was the navigator on board the starship Voyager. Now, questions people like to say is, well, was Nick Locarno, like when they made Voyager, was Nick Locarno originally supposed to be the Tom Paris character? But everything I've read said no. there was no redeeming Nick Locarno from this episode. Spoilers, but Tom Paris, I presume Robert Duncan McNeil auditioned for him, or else they wanted him. But regardless, he played Tom Paris. He did not play Nick Locarno. He's never supposed to play Nick Locarno in Voyager, from what I understand. But given he played those two roles in a short amount of time, Nick Locarno looks identical to Tom Paris. Come April, we had The Probe by Margaret Wander Bonanno published. This is a bit of a controversy because she didn't write that book, but I won't go into all that. But basically, it's a book that details the whale probe from Star Trek IV, tries to give it a little bit of an origin story. And as you'll find in a lot of these Star Trek books, the Borg are involved in some aspect, and I won't say anything more than that. It's a very small appearance by the Borg, but they show up all the same. They like to show up in a lot of be involved with a lot of things that were going on. Anyway, I like the book. I know Margaret Wander Bonanno has disavowed it because she didn't actually write it, but I liked it for what it was. May 11th, though, speaking of the Borg, we had Iborg. This was the first appearance of the Borg after the Best of Both Worlds. And what happened was a Borg ship crashed. The Enterprise D crew found it, and they found a single Borg who had survived. Now, the Enterprise D crew was told that they had to upload a virus into this lone Borg to return him to his collective, which would basically destroy the collective, which was effectively genocide. But as they find with this lone Borg, as they keep him on the ship for longer, he starts to develop individuality and he becomes Hugh. And so that makes things even more complicated because now he's not just a faceless zombie, he's an individual. And now they're like, well, what do we do? Do we return him to the Borg? Do we put the virus into him and return him to the Borg? Do we keep him? What are we supposed to do? And it's another good episode, probably one of the better Borg episodes too, after the Best of Both Worlds. June 1st, we had The Inner Light. This is another very well-regarded episode. This is, I believe, one of Patrick Stewart's favorite of all the ones that he shot for this show. There's a probe that confronts the Enterprise, and Captain Picard suddenly finds himself, the probe basically, I won't go into all of it, basically, the probe, I believe, scans the ship, and then suddenly Captain Picard finds himself living another life living another life, with a family, and he's like, what's going on here? This is who I am. But they're like, no, you're not. You're just, you're suffering from amnesia or memory loss. And it's just, it's not sinister at all. It's very heartwarming, touching, as Captain Picard, becomes this other person and lives a fulfilling life with a family and kids. And it's just, like he says, very touching episode. If you had to watch one episode of The Next Generation, most people would say, this one is definitely one to recommend. Come August 18th, shooting begins on Star Trek Deep Space Nine Emissary, the upcoming TV series. They've been working on it all this year. I know there's a lot of controversy. Was Deep Space Nine a ripoff, or did they intentionally make this series to counter program Babylon 5 from J. Michael Straczynski? J. Michael Straczynski says yes. I don't know. I was not involved in any of this, but the interesting thing about Deep Space Nine Emissary, though, is it does feature the Cardassians and the Bajorans. But what you may not know is Nana Visitor was not supposed to be on this show as Major Kira. They had really wanted Michelle Forbes, who had played Ensign Ro. They wanted her on this show as the Bajoran character. In fact, for those of you who own, like I do, the making of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, there's actually a script treatment in that book where they have how it would have played out if Ensign Ro had been the person assigned to Deep Space Nine. But Michelle Forbes didn't want to do it because she didn't want to be involved on it. She wanted to be assigned to a TV show. She wanted to make movies when she could. And so she turned them down. And I think it was really to Star Trek Deep Space Nine's benefit, because I feel like Nana Visitor and Major Kira was a much better character and allowed them to do more than if it had been Ensign Ro. And there were people who had attended this session live when I did it earlier this week who felt the same, that it wouldn't have been the same without Major Kira in the place, because her role as not being a Federation officer but being a Bajoran liaison allowed for more compelling storylines, we all thought. October 12th was a fun one. Relics. James Doohan came back as Montgomery Scott. He was the engineer of the Enterprise. He'd found himself in the 24th century and he felt time had passed him by, and it was rough on him, but he found his place, and it was a good episode. He gave it. It was fun to see James Doohan again. Now, what also happened this year was that Playmate Toys began its Star Trek line of action figures, ships, and play sets. And they made a lot of toys. They made a lot of them. In fact, that's why that is my highlight, not just of this year, but in general. You can always find these toys, whether at a secondhand shop or at a garage sale or anything like that. They just made so many of them, but I always enjoy going to the store as a kid and seeing these on the shelves. I really like the ships more. I had the Enterprise D battle damaged version from Generations, as well as a couple of the other ships that they did, but I also made the mistake of being too impressionable, where I crashed my Enterprise D battle damage ship into a sandbox, thinking that would be just like it was in Star Trek Generations, which was upcoming. And you don't want to put sand into a toy like that, because I effectively broke it. But it's still good memories to be had. All right, moving on. We're on now up to 1993. This was an important year for Star Trek, because on January 3rd, Deep Space Nine Emissary premiered, which was the premiere episode of Deep Space Nine. If you have no familiarity with Deep Space Nine, Deep Space Nine is a space station. It was built by the Cardassians, and when they were occupying Bajor, home of the Bajorans, the Cardassians have basically picked Bajor clean, so they've left. And then the Bajorans asked the Federation to oversee the space station. Well, what they find is that next to Bajor is a wormhole that will take you from the Alpha Quadrant, where they are, into the Gamma Quadrant, which is someplace nobody has been to in their quadrant. So it sort of becomes like St. Louis, if you will, basically the sort of the gateway to the Wild West, and suddenly Bajor and Deep Space Nine become very important. And then that sets up the premise for Deep Space Nine. February 22nd, TNG Birthright Part 1 airs. I only mention this because this was a crossover between The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine to a degree. And it happened almost right away after Deep Space Nine started airing, because now we had two Star Trek shows on the air for the first time together in Star Trek history. This was kind of fun in spots. I think overall this two-parter was not my favorite, but basically we got to see Captain Picard and Beverly Crusher on the Star Trek Deep Space Nine sets, and we got to see Alexander Siddig on board, or Siddig Al Fadil in those days, as Dr. Bashir on board the Enterprise. Of course, he wasn't supposed to be there. They originally were trying to get Terry Farrell as Lieutenant Dax to appear, but her schedule didn't allow it. But anyway, it's just fun to see him on board the Enterprise. It's something to see some of the Enterprise crew on board Deep Space Nine. And so that was like a fun little crossover. We talk about, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all these connected universes. Well, Star Trek was one of the first to do that. March 21st, we had Deep Space Nine, The Nagus. Wallace Shawn plays the Grand Nagus, who was sort of the godfather of the Ferengi people. The Ferengi people are an alien species whose entire purpose is the acquisition of wealth. Oh, they're much more nuanced than that. But anyway, given it's Wallace Shawn, he plays such a goofball character, but he would show up here regularly throughout the Deep Space Nine years. But it's a fun episode. It's his first appearance, and like I said, if you want to know more about the Ferengi and how they became rehabilitated from their really like bizarre appearances in the early days of the Next Generation, I recommend watching Deep Space Nine, because Armin Shimmerman really turns things around as Quark, the Ferengi bartender of Deep Space Nine. On April 1st, we had Star Trek The Chronology was published. This was a reference book, which was designed to explain what happened year to year in Star Trek. Not in our world, but in the Star Trek universe. So if you want to know what happened in the 23rd century, you could read about all that. You want to know what happened in the 24th century, you could read about all that, so on and so forth. And they made 2 editions of this. I have the 2nd edition. They only made 2, but of course, I wish they made more, but they only made the 2. The second one was written during the early seasons of Voyager, but anyway, that's a fun reference book that you can get at the library, or I'm sure we can get for you from another library if you wanted it. September 20th, we're coming up slowly on the end of Star Trek The Next Generation because Season 7 premiered. We had Descent Part 2. The Descent Part 2 two-parters was, I don't know. I mean, aside from Best of Both Worlds, that was the best cliffhanger premiere set from one season to the next. By this point, I think they were just picking random ideas. They're like, who should we have in it? The Borg. Who should we have in it? Lore. Lore is Data's evil brother. Why don't we have them together? I'm not saying that's how it came about, but it felt like they were throwing ideas at a dartboard. Darts at a dartboard for ideas. Anyway, I'm not trying to poo-poo this, but that's how I feel. But this is just one person's opinion. So September 26th, we had Deep Space Nine Season 2 premiered. That was Homecoming. That was a three-parter. There hadn't really been many three-parters in this way. The Best of Both Worlds Part 1 and 2 had Family, which came on after, but it wasn't really as much of a third part as this three-parter was. This notably had Louise Fletcher had made a major role as Kai Wynn, the religious leader of the Bajoran people, and she would have multiple appearances throughout the rest of Deep Space Nine. She was sort of the antagonist to the Deep Space Nine crew. In October, we had the original series, A Great Starship Race, was published. This is a fun book. I like the ships most in Star Trek. So seeing a bunch of ships on the cover was really like, oh, I got to buy this. I got to read this. It's sort of like a starship scavenger hunt, only there's intrigue involved. November 1st, The Next Generation, The Dark Page. This episode featured a very young Kirsten Dunst. This was right before she did an interview with a vampire. Basically, in this one, Counselor Troy, her mother, sees Kirsten Dunst as an alien child, and suddenly her mother starts to lose her mind. And so Troy has to go into her mother's subconscious to figure out what is going on. Why is her mother being so afflicted? And it turns out that, spoilers, that Counselor Troy, Deanna Troy, had an older sister who she didn't know about, who had tragically drowned when Deanna was a baby. Her sister's older name was Kestra. Her older sister's name was Kestra. And for those Star Trek Picard fans out there, or people who watch Star Trek Picard, Deanna Troy later names her daughter Kestra in honor of her sister who has passed away. And it's a nice bonding episode between Deanna and her mother, as well as between Marina Sirtis and Majel Barrett Roddenberry. November 13th, Star Trek The Original Series, Judgment Rights, the PC game was released. I owned this in those days. It was for DOS. It came in a whole bunch of discs, but it was a fun series of, it's called a point and click adventure where you got to take command of the Enterprise crew and put them through a series of episodes where you had to solve various mysteries and various puzzles. When this game later was released on CD instead of the discs, they actually got the original series crew to voice their characters in this video game, or this PC game, which was a lot of fun. And now December we had The Next Generation, Dark Mirror was published. This is another case of the books being able to do what the TV series was unable to. This is where the Next Generation crew encounters their mirror universe counterparts, where they're evil counterparts. Because the original series cast had also encountered their evil mirror counterparts in a well-regarded episode called Mirror Mirror. So what was the highlight of this year? Well, I'm going to give it up to the books. And I don't mean just this year. I mean in general. I don't mean the books, because the books, I recommend the books if you're like a big fan of these various series, but you really wish they had made more episodes. Because a lot of the books and the comics basically feel like an episode of Star Trek that they just weren't able to do. So they've got ones about Star Trek, like Captain Picard and his days commanding the Stargazer. They talk about what happened between the Undiscovered Country and when Star Trek The Next Generation started. What happened in those intervening years, or what happened between the end of the original series and the beginning of Star Trek The Motion Picture. And they've been able to really dive into these characters. Now, a lot of these books, they're not canon. That means that what was written in them was never intended to influence the shows, but that doesn't mean they're not well written. You can still enjoy them, even if some of the stuff later got contradicted by future episodes. So if you haven't tried out the books, please do. They also wrote a whole series of books that occurred after Deep Space Nine and Voyager ended, and they had their own ideas for how things happened, and then they were actually able to create a conclusion for that series after Picard came out and basically had his own ideas for what happened after Deep Space Nine and Voyager. But it's really good. The Destiny trilogy was what started it off. We can see it over there on the right-hand side. So yeah, if you haven't read the books, please do. If you need a recommendation, please ask. Otherwise, we got some of the books here, and any ones that we don't have, we can request for you. So moving on to 1994, February 7th, we had The Next Generation, Lower Decks. I don't mean that Lower Decks, the cartoon show, which is the animated series, whose name and premise is based on this. Lower Decks involved a bunch of junior crew members who were pretty much meeting for the first time, and about their attempts to rise up the ranks, as well as trying to better understand what are the motivations behind the crew that we know, because there's a mystery going on, and the lower deckers, as it were, the junior officers, are confused about what's going on, and then they do find out what's going on. And one of them, unfortunately, meets a tragic end. It's a very tragic ending, but it's still a very well done episode that in season 7 was very well regarded. March 29th was when filming began on Star Trek Generations, the movie. April 6th is sort of a sad day for us Next Generation fans. This was when they had Wrap Day on TNG. Wrap Day is basically the last day they filmed for the series. It was the beginning of the end for the Next Generation, at least as far as on TV goes. On May 1st, Star Trek The Encyclopedia was published. This is a big, thick book, of which I still own to this day, which covered, it covered all the Star Trek up until that point with encyclopedia entries. And given this was the days when the internet was in its infancy, streaming video was virtually non-existent. And if you didn't catch it on TV, you'd hope you have to record it or else wait for reruns. So I learned so much about Star Trek in such a short amount of time, just pouring through this encyclopedia. May 23rd, this made the newspapers where I grew up in Champaign. This and my neighbors let me know about it because they were big Star Trek fans. All good things. The series finale aired. I don't think you could have gotten a better series finale for the Next Generation crew. Basically, Captain Picard is traveling through time from the first season to the 7th season in the future, trying to figure out why there's an anomaly that's threatening to swallow the galaxy, and his attempts to stop it. This is also well regarded by Marvel Cinematic Universe producer Kevin Feige. He specifically cited this episode as being an influence on Avengers Endgame, because it also had a time travel element involved, as well as being the finale of the MCU up until that point. Now, June 12th, though, this was the Deep Space Nine Season 2 finale. We had the Jem'Hadar. The Jem'Hadar were a group of 8 lizard warriors who were part of the Dominion, whose rulers were called the Founders. And they lived in the Gamma Quadrant, and that's where the wormhole led to. And they were none too happy about these interlopers or intruders on their territory. So they basically said, we're putting an end to this. And so they, as the saying goes, the Klingons think they're the baddest guys in the galaxy. The Jem'Hadar are the baddest guys in the galaxy. So yeah, their final act was blowing up a Galaxy-class starship, the same as the Enterprise D, and they would play a big role in the upcoming seasons of Deep Space Nine. So, starting September 6th, though, filming began on Star Trek Voyager's pilot, The Caretaker, or just Caretaker. Now, what you may not know is, we know Kate Mulgrew as Catherine Janeway. That's who was in the series. Well, she was not originally cast to be Catherine Janeway. She basically admitted that she blew in her biography, Born with Teeth, Kate Mulgrew says that she blew the initial audition. But what happened was they instead cast Genevieve Bujold, who was a well-known actor at that time. Well, 2 days into filming, she realized that she was not cut out to be filming a TV show. So she was let go. Meanwhile, now they're scrambling to figure out who's not going to be Captain Janeway. In fact, they even changed her name. Her first name was either Nicole Janeway or Elizabeth Janeway. I'm uncertain which, but they realized they were going to call her Catherine from then on. But then they had to scramble to find somebody, so they invited Kate Mulgrew and some other actors to come back and audition. And basically they auditioned her either on a Wednesday or Thursday or so on and so forth. And they said, and then they called her the next day or whatever and said, great, you're the captain. We need you here on Monday. And so that's why we now know Kate Mulgrew as Catherine Janeway. September 23rd and October 3rd, Deep Space Nine, The Search. This is where they introduced the USS Defiant to the Deep Space Nine crew. The Defiant was a warship who they needed to include, they needed the ship as part of the series because their little runabouts or war canoes, as they call them, they were no match for the Jem'Hadar, and they really needed a starship to get them off the space station more often to help, to do more with the plot. So in The Search parts 1 and 2, they went searching for the Dominion and the founders in order to convince them that the Federation is friendly and not their enemy, and they fail in that regard. And then they find out that in fact the Dominion, the founders, are a group of shapeshifters, and the Deep Space Nine security officer is also a shapeshifter. He is a member of their people, only he had been sent away as a child and he had no idea that his people were the founders. And Odo, then has to, now Odo, their security officer, he's in a bit of a bind because now his people don't like the Federation and they are going to do something about it. Now, from what I'd heard, the Federation Dominion War was only supposed to last, like the whole thing with the Dominion was only supposed to last like 2 episodes, but the writers were able to convince the higher ups to say, no, this really needs to be the plot from now on. And it's a good thing they did too. November 1st, we had Star Trek The Next Generation Federation was published. I like this book. This was a intergenerational story between the original series cast and the Next Generation crew, where the original series cast with Captain Kirk were solving a mystery. And the Next Generation crew was having to deal with another mystery of their own, which was tied into the original series cast's mystery. So it was 2 alternating stories, but again, I really enjoyed it. A lot of this stuff got contradicted later on in First Contact because it involves Ephraim Cochrane, but I still enjoy it. It's still one of my favorites. November 18th, Star Trek The Next Generation Generations premieres. Captain Kirk meets Captain Picard, and that's all I'll say in that regard for spoiler reasons, but it was the first Next Generation movie in theaters, and I did see this in theaters. Whether it was 1994 or shortly thereafter in 1995, regardless, I did see this in theaters, although long after it had already come out. I saw it in a budget theater, but anyway, yeah, I saw that. That was the first Star Trek movie I saw in theaters. So Unknown, Star Trek The Next Generation, Futures Past / Echoes of the Past for the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis game was released. I say Unknown, it came out in 1994, but I'm not sure the exact date. But I played this back in those days. It was a fun little puzzle game. You got to command the crew of the Enterprise D and fly through space and try and solve a mystery. There's a lot of mysteries in Star Trek, but that's what you get when you got a video game. I rented this in the past from Blockbuster, and I bought it a few years ago, and I really need to get back and actually play it. So what was a highlight this year? Well, it's a little bit of a trifecta. Of course, Star Trek Generations, although this says November 18th, but I think the release date got moved around a little bit. Well, okay, November 18th. But anyway, so November 18th, 1994, we had Star Trek Generations. Of course, we had the Jem'Hadar come out on Deep Space Nine. Certainly, they would play a big role in the upcoming years of Star Trek. And of course, we also have Star Trek All Good Things. So this was a good year for Star Trek. We had both a wrapping up of the past and advancing into the future. 2 captains, 1 destiny. So moving on to 1995, on January 2nd and January 9th, we had Deep Space Nine, Past Tense, parts 1 and 2. Captain Sisko, Julian Bashir, and Jadzia Dax are actually transported into the past to a 21st century Earth. And Captain Picard and Dr. Bashir find themselves trapped in a homeless encampment. Basically, in this time frame, in order to solve the homeless problem, the cities had basically set up homeless districts where all the homeless people were corralled and weren't allowed to leave and had no rights. And and what that entails and eventually leads to, spoilers, rebellion. I say this because it seems like, but the only reason I mention this is these episodes keep coming up more and more these days because there have been politicians who have actually suggested that this is what we need to do to deal with the homeless situation, is to is to put them into these districts. And it's just, like I said, it's a cautionary tale if ever. Moving on, January 16th, Voyager begins airing. This was when Caretaker came out. This was also the debut of the United Paramount Network, or UPN as they called it. Voyager was the first show that aired on UPN. It was sort of the cornerstone of UPN, is how they build UPN, was that Star Trek Voyager was going to be exclusively on this network. Although my recollection is we didn't have UPN in my market, so I think they aired this on Fox and later on the WB network. But anyway, so yeah, so that was fun. Star Trek mattered so much to Paramount that they wanted it to launch their new network. Just like today, when Star Trek Discovery was regarded, and Star Trek is regarded as the sort of cornerstone of Paramount Plus. And I won't go into it, but in the late 70s, Paramount wanted to launch its TV network then, and Star Trek Phase 2 was supposed to be the cornerstone of that network until everything fell apart. And if you're not familiar with Star Trek Phase 2, look it up. So on February 6th, we actually had 2 episodes of Star Trek premiere on the same day. We had Heart of Stone, and this episode for Deep Space Nine, and this episode freaked me out as a kid. I'm not ashamed to admit that. Kira got trapped in a rock, and Odo tried to do everything he could to free her, and this rock kept growing and growing and growing, and basically, trapping her entire body inside of it. And this episode, like, oh gosh, I don't know that I can watch this episode again. There is a twist at the end, as there sometimes are, but I just no. Although also this day, we had Voyager, the Phage aired. Now we have staff on at the library. We're big fans of Star Trek. I have a coworker in my department who was a big fan of Deep Space Nine, more so than I am, but she got freaked out by the episode of Voyager, the Phage, because this involves a species called the Vidians, who are suffering from a plague that's slowly dissolving their, this is getting kind of gory, dissolving their flesh, dissolving their bodies. And so they have to basically steal body parts in order to survive. And that episode freaked her out. So I guess we both got freaked out on the same day on different shows. Thank you, Star Trek. April 17th, Deep Space Nine Through the Looking Glass. This was the Deep Space Nine crew encountered the Mirror Universe, their Mirror Universe counterparts. Only in this case, the Mirror Universe was dealing with the repercussions of the original series crew, who had gone to the Mirror Universe first, because Captain Kirk convinced the evil Spock that revolution was possible to become good and not evil, and then what that involved later on down the road, what the repercussions of that suggestion were. May, we had the revised and expanded Star Trek The Next Generation Companion was published. This is a reference book where it goes through each episode of The Next Generation and offers commentary on it from cast and crew. Also, Star Trek The Next Generation, a Final Unity PC game is released. This is another point and click adventure that featured the cast of the Enterprise D and solving basically, they encountered a species called the Chodak, who are interested in something called the Unity device. And they're trying to figure out, what is the Unity device? Why the Chodak want it? Why the Romulans want it? And is this device good or bad? And I owned this as a kid. And this game blew my mind in 1995. This is everything I could have wanted in a Star Trek PC game. October 2nd of Deep Space Nine. This was, I believe, the season 4 premiere. Worf from The Next Generation joined Deep Space Nine. Yes, Deep Space Nine added another character who we had known and loved from 7 seasons of The Next Generation. And it was just another way of adding a character and adding more intrigue and adding more plot lines that were possible for the Deep Space Nine crew. There was some concern over the existing crew that now they're adding another character. Would they lose lines and lose screen time? But everything worked out. They warmed up to Michael Dorn as commander, as Lieutenant Worf. And it was just fun to see more Worf. So yeah, so that's fun. And he would stay on for the rest of the show. October 9th, we had Deep Space Nine, The Visitor. This was certainly a very heart-wrenching episode, but well regarded, of Deep Space Nine. Tony Todd plays an older version of Jake Sisko, who is Captain Sisko's son. And a reporter comes to him and talks to him about his life, because he was a writer as an older man. He talks about how when he was much younger, his father, Captain Sisko, was killed in an accident on board the Defiant. But this accident didn't really kill Captain Sisko. It caused him to appear every few years in front of Jake for a few moments, and he would see how his life was going, and just realizing that Jake was never able to move on past the death, if you will, of his father. And so it's basically like he's now a sort of not really a broken old man, but he's just like, what, my younger self, he needs my dad. He needs his dad. And what is he going to do, the older Jake, to make that happen? And like I said, Tony Todd really did a good job as the older Jake Sisko. But from a heart-wrenching episode to a fun episode, on November 13th, Deep Space Nine, Little Green Men aired. Quark, his brother Rom, and his nephew Nog, they travel through time and crash in Roswell on Earth, and they are basically now the Roswell aliens. And they get taken by the government, and now Quark, because he's from the future and because he's a businessman, is plotting to take over the Earth financially. And the question is, are they able to alter time? How do they get home? And it's just like, it's just a really goofy episode, but I remember watching this when it aired, and I had a good time with it. November, here's a fun one for you for the internet fans. The official Star Trek website launched. Yes, way back in 1995. I did use the internet in the mid 90s, but I don't recall ever going to the Star Trek website until later on. But it was so much fun going on the Star Trek website and seeing these on a 56K modem, taking forever to download like these little Star Trek. They had the Star Trek episode teasers. And so just seeing that, it was all grainy, but just the idea of being watching video on the internet was just like, wow, this is the future. The future has arrived. And now it's much more taken off since then. So what was the highlight of this year? Well, this may seem controversial, but I'm going to give it to Star Trek: The Next Generation, A Final Unity. I love this game. As soon as I saw it in Seattle, when I was visiting my grandparents, my mom saw that I really liked this game, and so when we came back to Champaign, where I grew up, she bought it for me, and I play this all the time on my computer. I had so much fun with this game. Sadly, you can't really play this much today, but you can watch videos of it on YouTube. But yeah, if you ever want to, this was such a fun game. They got all the cast to come back and voice their characters, and it's just, yeah, this was just such a fun game. You can watch people play this on YouTube, and it's just really engrossing. It's a fun storyline. It's a fun game, and if they ever get it working on modern systems, I'd really encourage, if you're a big Star Trek: Next Generation fan, to play it. So moving on to 1996. 1991 was the 25th anniversary. Now we are at Star Trek's 30th anniversary. Although I don't know that as big a celebration as the 25th did, but that's okay. Any anniversary is a good one, in my opinion. Although we left off with a low note. On January 29th, we had Voyager Threshold, which is regarded as one of the worst pieces of Star Trek ever produced. As someone said during the program when I did it live earlier, Brandon Braga, who was one of the producers of Star Trek, regrets this episode in the worst way possible. Long story short, Tom Paris on board Voyager's shuttlecraft is able to go to warp 10, which is not something you're supposed to be able to go that fast. Well, when he comes back, he mutates into a lizard person, and then he kidnaps Captain Janeway, and she mutates into a lizard person, and then something else happens, which I refuse to even say out loud. But anyway, I saw this episode when it aired, and even in those days, I'm like, no, never again. I probably need to watch this episode. I have no desire to do so. And if this is one of your favorite episodes, hey, you keep right on thinking that. I am not here to tell you differently. All right, so February 19th, we had Voyager Death Wish. This was Q was now dealing with the Voyager crew, and basically there was another member of Q's species, and he was basically tired of being a Q. He didn't want to live forever. He didn't want to be omnipotent. He wanted to stop being a Q, and he wanted to die. And the Voyager crew was now stuck in a dilemma because they basically had to put on a trial and decide, would they allow this Q to become human, and what happens if he tried to kill himself? Meanwhile, the original Q, who was the one who didn't want this to happen, he basically told the Voyager crew, If you judge in my favor, I'm gonna send you back to Earth. Because right now the Voyager crew, I forgot to say what the plot line was of Voyager. I presume you know, but if you didn't know the plot line of Voyager, they actually got thrown into the Delta Quadrant where there's no Federation. It's going to take them years to get back home. So basically, they're on a long trek back home to the Federation, the Alpha Quadrant. But Q said, "I'll send you home if you vote in my favor." So it's just a big dilemma on their part. April 15th, we had Deep Space Nine Hard Time. I saw this when this aired. I don't normally get emotional or sad when I watch a Star Trek episode, but this episode broke me. Basically, Chief O'Brien who was the air engineering chief on Deep Space Nine, he got wrongfully accused of a crime and he was trapped in a virtual prison. And so he had to live out his sentence in this virtual prison. And then when he came out of it, you saw flashbacks to what had happened to him. He was in prison with a lone cellmate, and it's just such a sad episode. I mean, like I said, I got real emotional watching this. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I don't know if I could ever watch this episode again, but it was because of those memories. They're just with me even all these years later. But it was just a well done episode. That's really all I can say without going into spoiler territory. April 29th, we had Voyager The Thaw. This was a good episode. The Voyager crew encountered this alien species that were in cryogenic suspension, even though they should have been released years ago. And they're figuring out why is it? Well, it turns out that their subconscious had generated a evil clown who didn't want them to leave, because if the aliens got out of suspended animation, then he would effectively die. So then basically it's a good episode for Kate Mulgrew as Catherine Janeway as she deals with this killer clown, because she wants to get the aliens out of cryogenic suspension, but at the same time, this clown doesn't want them to leave, and he can actually start killing the crew or killing the people who are in suspended animation. So it's definitely a very it's definitely a suspenseful episode of Star Trek. May 13th, Deep Space Nine to the Death. Jeffrey Combs debuted as Wei-Yun. Jeffrey Combs, you may know him from Reanimator, but he had appeared a few times in Star Trek as different alien species. The producers and the crew really liked him. He debuted as Wei-Yun. Wei-Yun is a Vorta. The Vorta are basically the lackeys or the toadies of the Dominion. They basically the shapeshifters basically have them supervise the Jem'Hadar, and it's just he plays such a wonderfully sort of regal character who of course is up to no good because he's part of the bad guys, as it were. But he was so popular that actually in this episode he died. Wei-Yun died, but they wanted him back as Wei-Yun. So basically Wei-Yun was then revealed to be a member of a clone species, so they could kill him off and bring him back as a clone whenever they wanted to. So that was fun. And he would appear routinely throughout the rest of the series of Deep Space Nine. June 1st, Inside Star Trek, The Real Story is published. This was done by a couple of the producers of the original series, and they talked about their experiences on that show. And some of the things they had to say was really eye-opening to me. There was a lot of good stuff in there, like Lucille Ball and her involvement with getting Star Trek on the air. But at the same time, there was a bunch of other stuff which was really non-Lucille Ball related, which definitely helped highlight that it was definitely the swinging 60s, as they call, and that's all I'll say in that regard. Anyway, September 11th, we started to have the 30th anniversary celebrations of Star Trek. Voyager, we had Flashback, which involved the Vulcan character on Voyager. His name was Tuvok. He started hallucinating about his days on board the USS Excelsior, which was commanded by George Takei as Captain Sulu. And he has flashbacks to right around the time when Star Trek VI was airing, when Star Trek VI happened. So, because Vulcans are long-lived. And this was fun. George Takei came back as Captain Sulu. They got a couple other characters to come back too. And so, yeah, that was just fun of him, honoring the original series was what this was. And Deep Space Nine took it a step further on November 4th, where they had Trials and Tribulations. This involved basically what they did with the episode was, it's based off of a original series episode called The Trouble with Tribbles. The Tribbles are a group of little small alien creatures who are, everyone loves the Tribbles, but the problem is that when they eat food, they multiply out of control. And this was a fun comedic episode of the original series that a lot of people remember. And so, what happened was, so what they, by this point in our world with technology, Forrest Gump had come out, and in Forrest Gump, they were able to use technology to make Forrest Gump appear in historical events. Like, I mean, I believe like Richard Nixon and a couple other people, and inserting him into like footage from those days, acting as though Tom Hanks had actually been there, where they were able to sort of use this technology to take the Deep Space Nine crew and put them into this original series episode. So basically they're either in the background or they actually are interacting with characters. They did a lot of trickery to pull this off, but they did it really well on a TV show budget. And so, yeah, I'd really recommend you watch The Trouble with Tribbles and then turn around and watch Deep Space Nine Trials and Tribulations, because that was the 30th anniversary celebration. It was just, it's a real fun episode. We also find out that the Klingons hated the Tribbles so much they hunted them into extinction. But then you realize that, but then the final, and I won't spoil the final shot of the episode, but basically the Klingons are in for a world of trouble. A trouble with tribbles. All right, November 22nd, we had Star Trek First Contact premieres. I certainly remember seeing this in theaters as well. Although what confused me was in the poster, because I knew the Enterprise D had been destroyed, but on the poster, because the Enterprise E is off in the distance being chased by the Borg cube, the Enterprise E, to me as a young kid, I'm like, wait a minute, isn't that the original series Enterprise? Does that mean the crew of the original Enterprise is going to encounter the Borg? I was so confused. And then, well, of course, watching it made sense. That wasn't the original series Enterprise. That was the Enterprise E, which had yet to appear on TV. I mean, in theaters or on any of our screens. So what were the highlights this year? Star Trek First Contact, of course, a very well done episode. Definitely the best for me of the Next Generation movies. I really like this one. We talk about shared universes so much nowadays. The Marvel Cinematic Universe characters get to encounter each other in different movies. Well, in this movie, we had really the first inklings of that in Star Trek, and Star Trek more or less did it first. When the Borg cube comes for the Earth, because the plot premise is the Borg want to assimilate the Earth. They always do. Well, in order to stop the Borg cube, Starfleet sends its ships after it, and one of them is the USS Defiant from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And for those of you, and for me, this was like really a highlight for me, because I really liked the Defiant, and I knew that when I had watched Deep Space Nine at that point, they said that the Defiant had originally been built to fight the Borg, not the Dominion. So in this movie, we got to see the Defiant take on the Borg cube for which was this original intended purpose. And for me, it's like, oh, that's the Defiant. I mean, if you didn't know Deep Space Nine, you would just assume it's another ship. But to see it there, to see it commanded by Mr. Worf, and have the Enterprise E go flying by, I was like, as a kid who's a big fan of starships and Star Trek, oh man, this still gives me excitement to this day. That's a really good movie. The Borg go into the past and try and kill the guy who invented the warp drive, Zephyr Cochrane, and then the Enterprise crew has to stop the Borg from assimilating the Earth in the process. The other highlight would be, Trials and Tribulations. Here we can see a shot. This wasn't even from the Trouble with Tribbles. This was actually from, I believe, Mirror Mirror. But they used it to basically insert, in this particular scene, they were able to insert Avery Brooks, so it seemed like he was carrying on a conversation with Captain Kirk. Again, so well done, especially on TV budget. You really can't really tell that there's really any trickery going on here, although you obviously know it is, because, obviously this episode was not shot in the 1960s. All right, moving on to 1997. We're sort of getting more heavily focused on Voyager now than Deep Space Nine, because I watched a fair amount of Deep Space Nine, but in these days I was really watching a lot more Voyager than I was Deep Space Nine. And whereas my coworker who's a big fan of Deep Space Nine will say, hey, Omar, remember this episode of Deep Space Nine? I'd be like, no, I don't. I didn't see that. And she'd be like, what? And then she's just ashamed for me. Anyway, so February 5th, we had Voyager Blood Fever. I won't go into what the plot of this is, but basically Voyager encountered evidence of the Borg. This is important because the Borg live in the Delta Quadrants, which is where Voyager is, only there's no Federation. There's now just Voyager, and Voyager's realizing, oh no, we're in a lot of trouble now. We're in Borg territory. April 9th, we had Voyager Before and After. Kes travels through time. Kes was an alien in the Delta Quadrant who the Voyager crew found. She was played by Jennifer Leon, and she was a regular on the show. Basically, this is fun because they actually ended up teasing a couple episodes that were yet to come later on in the year that weren't even in the same season. Basically, a setup in the upcoming episodes, Year of Hell, Part 1 and 2, are why she's traveling through time. So it was just fun to see them tease something which wouldn't come out until the end of the year. April 21st, we had Voyager Real Life, which involved the Doctor. The Doctor on Voyager, the human Doctor, or their actual Doctor got killed. So so the Doctor now on Voyager is a holographic Doctor. Anyway, he decided he wanted to explore what it was like to be more human. So he had a holographic family in the holodeck. Is this really a highlight of a lot of people's when it comes to Star Trek? Probably not, but I liked it and I enjoyed it, so that's why it's here. Again, this is my list. I can choose what I want. May 21st and September 3rd, we had Voyager Scorpion Parts 1 and 2 airs. This was the introduction of 7 of 9, played by Jerry Ryan, and this was also when she got introduced. Kes then departed from the show. 7 of 9 was a Borg member who later became part of the Voyager crew. There's a little bit of a brouhaha about why was 7 introduced and why was Kes given the boot, and was Kes supposed to have been the original character given the boot? It was really, people thought it was going to be somebody else. Anyway, like I said, that's all hearsay, and I will not comment on it, but it's definitely interesting to think about in terms of what maybe had been originally happening. But anyway, 7 of 9 would now be the new crew member of Voyager. June 16th for Deep Space Nine, we had Call to Arms. This was the season 5 finale. This is when the Dominion War officially broke out. The Dominion were like, you know what, we've had it. We're taking over the Alpha Quadrant. And so basically this has a really good battle sequence, especially for TV, where the Dominion attack Deep Space Nine and actually take over Deep Space Nine, and our heroes are forced to flee, but not before mining the wormhole. So now the Dominion can't get reinforcements through the wormhole. So then, like I said, it's nothing but war from here on out. September 20th, we had Star Trek Starfleet Academy released on PC. This is another one of those PC games that blew my mind. It came on like 5 or 6 discs. And what you did was you played a Starfleet cadet who has his own group of cadets whom he's their captain, as it were. Featured William Shatner, George Takei, and Walter Koenig as Captain Kirk, Captain Sulu, and Lieutenant and Commander Chekhov. As this was their first final appearances in anything Star Trek related as their characters, but basically we basically were on these simulated starships, sort of like at the beginning of Star Trek II. And so basically went through all these missions and had these live action sequences that are filmed where your character can make different decisions regarding his crew, and their morale would go up and down. And if you screwed up enough times, you could wash out of Starfleet Academy. So again, highly recommended on my part. I really enjoyed this game. November 3rd, Deep Space Nine, Sacrifice of Angels. This also had a large, lengthy battle sequence that you normally didn't see on television. This is when the crew of Deep Space Nine came back to get back their space station from the Dominion, because the Dominion figured out how to get rid of the mines in the wormhole and allow their reinforcements to come through from the Gamma Quadrant. Again, a really well done episode. November 5th and November 12th, finally we have Voyager Year of Hell Part 1 and 2, which was, again, these events led to what happened in Before and After, even though by this point Jennifer Leon was no longer part of the crew. This is the future that she saw was a future that was not to come. But anyway, what I like about this one is this two-parter is that basically Voyager encounters a species that is very aggressive, but in addition to being aggressive, they can also alter time at their whim. And so Voyager now gets caught in this war between these species who are having their time forcibly altered by this enemy called the Krenim. And so Voyager gets more and more wrecked as the two-parter goes on. And what's interesting about this is, like, Voyager was supposed to have been this way for the entire series. One episode was supposed to lead into the next. Voyager was supposed to run out of torpedoes. It was supposed to run out of shuttles. It was supposed to get more and more, damaged as it went throughout the Delta Quadrant, because they had no way of fixing their ship, really. except the producers supposedly didn't want, because in those days they didn't want to have serialized television too much. They didn't want to have it to be like where if you didn't watch episodes 1 through 4, you wouldn't understand episode 5. Well, Deep Space Nine was doing more serialized storytelling, but they didn't want Voyager to be that way. So the original people who had come on to Voyager were like, well, wait a minute, that's not what we were promised. We were promised that, that there would be consequences from one episode to the next. So Voyager Year of Hell was like the one time we got to see consequences for what was happening to Voyager as it went throughout the years. And anyway, and in a spectacular moment, definitely a highlight for Captain Janeway. And I won't say what it was, but anyway, yeah, oh boy. Anyway, she went out on a high note, let's put it that way, at least until things went back to, as I said, this wasn't a serialized show, but so by the next episode things were back to normal. No surprise there. November 10th, Deep Space Nine, you were cordially invited. Worf married Dax. So Worf, they fell in love throughout the earlier seasons, and yeah, so they got married. Deep Space, December 17th, Deep Space Nine, we had another fun Ferengi episode called The Magnificent Ferengi. This is exactly what you think it is. The Quark and his brother Rom, well, anyway, their mom gets kidnapped by the Dominion. And so basically they have to assemble a group of Ferengi who had largely appeared in the earlier episodes, one of whom was Jeffrey Combs as Brunt. They assembled that group to then go rescue their mom. And so basically, because Jeffrey Combs was playing Brunt, he couldn't play Weyoun. And so what happened was the Vorta that they used for this episode was actually played by Iggy Pop. So Iggy Pop appeared in an episode of Star Trek. What was the highlight of this year? I'm going to hear it again from anyone watching this. I got to give it up to Starfleet Academy. Like I said, I love this game. Being able to pilot a starship and like dozens of battle simulations. I mean, to me as a kid, I'm like, because I'm first and foremost a Starship fan. I mean, you could do no wrong in my eyes. Having something like this. I also said some of the better combat in as far as Star Trek ships go, because there have been some games where the combat on the starships has just been plain awful. But yeah, they gave it to that D7 real good on this box art. But anyway, I really enjoyed this game, and in fact, I believe you can download it off. You have to pay for it, but like you can actually play this today on websites that are out there. So yeah, yep. All right, 1998. This is a pretty well-packed year, although we are coming up the end because we only got one more year to go. January 21st, we had Voyager Ship in a Bottle. This was the first appearance of the Hirogen. The Hirogen were sort of like the Predators. If you're familiar with the Predator movie franchise, they were a group of warriors who were always they were always up for battle. Well, they only made a brief cameo appearance in this episode, but they would later play more of a role as the series went on. They would appear more recurringly, but basically Voyager uses their network of satellites to send the Doctor, because he's a hologram, onto a Federation ship in the Alpha Quadrant. And anyway, the Doctor then encounters another holographic Doctor played by Andy Dick, and the two of them are the only ones on this ship because it's spoilers, it's been taken over by the Romulans. So they've got to figure out how are they going to get this ship back, and how they're going to relay that Voyager is in fact still alive. It was not destroyed. It was actually now in the Delta Quadrant. February 4th, Deep Space Nine, we had Who Mourns for Morn. Who is Morn, you ask? Well, Morn is basically the bar regular at Quark's bar. His name is, unsurprisingly, an anagram of Norm from Cheers. He is the local barfly. Well, you find out that Morn, because Morn kept coming back because they really liked him, even though Morn had like no dialogue throughout any of the Star Trek episodes and really didn't play a major role in any of them. Well, this was his major role. What you find out from him, although he still doesn't speak a word, what happens was Morn dies or is killed, and Quark finds out that Morn had previously, in another life seemingly, had gone with a group of criminals, and they ripped off a bank. They did a giant bank heist, and then shortly after that happened, Morn ran off with all the money. So Morn then seemingly gifts his shares or his money that he stole to Quark. Meanwhile, his other bank heist guys, the other people who were part of the bank heist who he jilted, they now come after Quark because they want their money. And then you find out by the end, it like I said, I saw this episode when it live. I originally, when I first saw it, I thought, oh, this seems so silly, but I really enjoyed it. Later on, I mean, this is such a fun episode, especially because it highlights Morn, even though again he has no dialogue. March 4th, we had Voyager: The Killing Game, parts 1 and 2 air. The Hirogen, who I just mentioned earlier, they take over the ship, and so what happened was, and they basically then, because they really like the idea of the holodeck, they're able to use the holodeck to simulate I believe primarily, I haven't seen this episode since it aired really. My recollection is that they simulated the holodeck and then erased the Voyager crew's memories and made them think that they were in World War II France during World War II, and the Hirogen were basically playing the Nazis from what I recall, and they were basically hunting them to again better improve their warrior instincts. I don't know how to say it, but anyway, that was these 2 episodes. Now you may say to yourself, well, Omar, these both aired on the same day, and they did. What happened is for the mid-season 2-parter, for not the season to season 2-parters, but for some of the mid-season 2-parters, what they did was they aired them together as sort of a feature-length episode. So basically, it would be like a 2-hour block of time, and they'd air one right after the other. And I definitely remember this one. I think this is when I found Voyager again on TV, because I think for a while there, like I said, we didn't get UPN where I grew up, but we eventually did get the WB network, and I believe that this was actually airing on the WB where I was. But anyway, I remember watching this episode when they advertised it and when it aired. And like I said, I liked it. I really need to get back to it. I really need to watch Voyager again, as well as Deep Space Nine, as well as all of Star Trek. All right, April 15th, what have we got? We've got Deep Space Nine and the Pale Moonlight, and Voyager: The Omega Directive. Yes, another time again where 2 episodes of Star Trek aired on the same day. And the Pale Moonlight is sort of controversial because basically Captain Sisko is recording his log and talking about how he basically lied and produced false evidence to convince the Romulans to join the Federation and the Klingons to fight the Dominion, because if they didn't get the Romulans to join them, then the Dominion War was on the verge of being lost. Now, this is controversial because in Gene Roddenberry's future, he didn't really like to see people be deceptive and do this sort of thing, but other people would argue that this is human. A human would do this. And so anyway, this episode is, like I said, it's controversial. And then we got also Voyager: The Omega Directive. Not much to say about this one. I remember watching this one. It aired. Basically involves this omega particle is what it is, and the Borg view it as perfection. They think this is perfect. The Borg want to achieve perfection, and they see omega as perfection. Well, the Starfleet crew of Voyager know that the omega particle could potentially destabilize warp drive in an entire area. So basically, if the omega particle explodes, then they're basically stuck there. There's no getting back home. And so basically, Seven is now caught in a dilemma, like, is it possible to stabilize this particle, or do they really have to get rid of it? And that provides a little bit of a conflict between her and Captain Janeway. April 29th, we had Voyager: Living Witness. This one involves, basically the premise is the Doctor, who's a hologram, well, he has a backup hologram. Well, that hologram got stolen, or at least I believe that was what the premise, how he ended up. But anyway, the backup hologram is now when he finally becomes activated, he's activated on this planet's on a planet in the Delta Quadrant. He's activated inside of their museum. Well, this is now hundreds of years after Voyager has already passed through their system. So these aliens in their museum have a rather warped idea of what happened when Voyager went through their system. They thought the Voyager crew were evil, and this Doctor has to set them right and say, no, everything you thought happened is not how it really happened. We're not a warship or a ship of peace. Now, the other reason I bring this up is because this occurred in close proximity to Discovery spoilers. Discovery, the show, like the ship, between season 2 and season 3 went into the far future, and that's where it is now. Well, the future it went into is only about, I believe, about 100 or so years after this episode takes place. And so basically this backup Doctor, he, at the end of the episode, spoilers, he says he's going back to the Alpha Quadrant. So people really hope that So some fans really want Robert Picardo as the holographic doctor, the backup copy, to show up in Star Trek Discovery. And hey, you know what? I wouldn't be opposed to that either. I would like to see that happen. May 6th, we have Deep Space Nine Valiant. This is where Jake and his friend Nog, Nog is a Ferengi, Quark's nephew. Well, Nog has basically matured as a character, and he's now gone off to Starfleet Academy to be the first Ferengi in Starfleet. Well, as he's returning to Deep Space Nine with Jake, they get ambushed by the Dominion, and they're saved by a Defiant class starship. Well, it's not the Defiant, it's the Valiant. The Valiant is now crewed by a bunch of Starfleet cadets. And then Jake and Nog are basically stuck in the situation where Jake thinks that these cadets are in over their heads, whereas Nog starts to develop hero worship. And so the question is, are these cadets really up to fighting in a war when they should have gone back to the Federation a long time ago? What's fun about this, though, is that the Valiant was the original proposed name for the Defiant. The reason why they didn't use Valiant is because I believe the network producers said, well, Voyager is coming out soon. We can't have two hero starships that start with the letter V. They thought that the audience would get confused. June 17th, we had Deep Space Nine, Tears of the Prophets. We're coming up to the end of Deep Space Nine. This was the season 6 finale. Alas, Jadzia Dax died. Oh, so sad. Terry Farrell, I guess. I mean, there's been differing answers for why she wanted to leave. I believe her latest, or one of her things was, it isn't that she didn't want to leave. It's not that she wanted to leave. It was just, she was burned out. I mean, there are long days of filming on Star Trek or on TV shows in general, one after another, and she just wanted to, she was tired of it, and she was willing, though, to be like a recurring character, but the producer was like, nope, we're not going to have you be a recurring character, we're just going to kill you off. So she got killed off. And I remember watching this and I was sad. And then September 30th, Deep Space Nine, Image in the Sand came out, and basically Jadzia Dax is a symbiont, a creature that lives inside of her that keeps the memories, and basically goes from host to host in a very, I don't like to think about when they showed the symbiont going from host to host, because they did it once. I'm like, oh gosh. I'm like, that's so gross. Anyway, the symbiont got transferred into a new character called Ezri, and her name is now Ezri Dax, because again, Dax is the name of the symbiont. Anyway, she was played by Nicole DeBear, and I saw both these episodes when they first aired, and for some reason, I just didn't watch much of Deep Space Nine 7th season. I don't know. I have nothing against Ezri. I think she definitely improved as a character. I just need to watch more episodes with her in it, because like I said, I really like Jadzia, and I was just disappointed to see, Ezri now taking her place. But from the episodes I've seen, Nicole DeBear did a really good job. So I'm really going to give her a second chance. I really need to watch season 7 of Deep Space Nine in its entirety, rather than just a handful of episodes. Here's a good one for you home media fans. October 6th, we had Star Trek First Contact, which was released on DVD. This was the first Star Trek DVD that ever came out back in 1998. So just think, in a few years, next year, we'll be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the first Star Trek DVD. October 14th, we had Voyager Night. It's dark, there's no stars, Captain Proton. This had a fun premise, to me at least. Basically, Voyager travels through this dark cloud in order to shave some time off of his journey. Well, now they can't see the stars, and crew slowly starts to develop cabin fever and lose their minds. And one way they can relieve their boredom is through the holodeck, and Lieutenant Paris and Ensign Kim have this Captain Proton holodeck simulation. Captain Proton is basically one of your serial B-movie serial characters like Flash Gordon from the old days. And so Captain Proton is basically the equivalent of your pulp sci-fi hero who always saves the day. And anyway, they in the first one, they co-opted 7 of 9 to join them in this holodeck. And they're like, 7, try and stop the evil robot. And she immediately who's basically just, like a cardboard tube, a walking cardboard tube. And she basically shuts him down right away and says, I'm done, can I leave? But they did a number of Captain Proton episodes after this, and Garrett Wang and Robert Duncan McNeil, they really want to do a Captain Proton series. on Paramount Plus, and I hope that happens too. That would be really fun. November 18th, we had Voyager Timeless. This is Voyager's 100th episode. This is a real good one. Basically, it starts off with these two characters walking across in the Alpha Quadrant, walking across the snowy expanse. And when you look down below them through the ice that they're standing on, you see that Voyager is actually trapped underneath the ice. What we find out is that Commander Chakotay, who's the first officer of Voyager, and Lieutenant and Ensign Kim, they're actually in, it's now the future. And what you find out is that Voyager found a way to rush home through something called slipstream. Well, what happened was on the way home, something went wrong, and basically Ensign Kim and Commander Chakotay, they were on a shuttle ahead of them. Well, they were able to make it to Earth, but Voyager fell out of slipstream early and crashed on this snow planet, and all the crew died. And meanwhile, now Chakotay and Kim have this survivor's guilt, especially Kim, because he was the one giving course corrections to Voyager. He feels it's all his fault. And so basically this was really a good episode for Garrett Wang. I felt he really was able to do a lot in this episode, acting wise, that he just wasn't able to do in many of the other episodes. Demonstrated that he had range, plus had a really good sequence where Voyager crashed. Anyway, and then on December 11th, we had Star Trek Insurrection premiered in theaters. I also saw this in theaters. I don't know if I saw it opening weekend or not, but I certainly saw it when it was in theaters. You know, this movie gets some flack to it, but personally, I enjoyed it. I mean, it feels like another episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Should that have been in a movie? Truthfully, I'd rather have seen them involved in the Dominion War, but it wasn't to be. But anyway, it's like an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. That's really all I can say. I do enjoy it. I don't love it, but I enjoy it. Now, throughout the year, we had Star Trek: The Dominion War novel miniseries released. This was a series of 4 books. 2 of them were the Next Generation books, and 2 of them were Deep Space Nine books. The 2 Deep Space Nine books were basically novelizations of several Star Trek Deep Space Nine episodes involving the Dominion, and I really liked it for that reason, because I don't know why I sort of stopped watching Star Trek Deep Space Nine around the season 4, season 5, and season 6, but when these came out, I was able to then catch up on what had happened, because again, no recording. I didn't have any recordings of it, and even the VHS tapes, I don't know, were all that easy to find. But anyway, but what was really good about this, though, was the 2 Next Generation novels. The 2 Next Generation novels finally had the Enterprise crew of the Enterprise E involved in the Dominion War. So what that means is that it showed the Enterprise E attacking Dominion ships and being attacked by the Dominion ships. Well, the ultimate plot of this is that now that the Federation controls Deep Space Nine, the Dominion cannot get reinforcements from the Gamma Quadrant through the wormhole, because that's the only way to get there. If they try to come any other way, it'd take them forever. Well, so what's interesting about this one is that the crew of the Enterprise E, they encounter Ro Laren again. I won't say what happened to Ro between what she did at the end of the Next Generation, but anyway, now she is on the bad side with the Next Generation crew. Anyway, they encounter her, but what they also realize is that the Dominion is trying to build an artificial wormhole so that they can send it to the Delta Quadrant to again get their reinforcements. And the Next Generation crew now has to deal with this artificial wormhole that they have to stop from them putting together. Well, what's interesting is that from what I heard is that the writers for Deep Space Nine, the show, they also wanted to have this plot of the Dominion building an artificial wormhole. But when they found out that the books were doing it, they're like, nope, we're not going to do it. They're like, nope. It's already been done in the books. We're not going to do it. And so they didn't want to repeat the plot from that, even though the guys in the books were like, no, I mean, we're happy to have you take this plot. Please take it. We're still going to make the books, but you're welcome to have it. But the writer's like, nope, we're not going to rehash this idea. So they didn't. So it was a missed opportunity, I thought. But hey, you know what? I really enjoyed the books. So, by all means, read them. Was highlight of this year. This may not be high on most people's list, but I really enjoyed Timeless. Here's a shot of the Voyager crashing on the ice planet, or the snow planet. But like I said, it gave Garrett Wang a lot to do. It was a well-directed episode. LeVar Burton directed it. And because he directed it, he got to have a cameo as Captain LaForge of the USS Challenger, a Galaxy-class starship. But anyway, like I said, it's a really good episode. Like I said, it's good thing of survivor's guilt. as well as trying to come up with a solution for how do you stop the Voyager crew from crashing on this planet and dying. How do you save them? And like I said, a really good episode for Ensign Kim. So now we're coming up at the end of our presentation. So in 1999, what do we have? Well, January 27th, we had Voyager, Bride of Chaotica. What happens is that Kim and Paris are playing their hologram of Captain Proton, and then these aliens come from another from another dimension into ours. Well, these aliens are also, I believe, they were holographic in nature. So when they came into the holodeck, they thought that humans aren't real to them, just like we don't think holograms are real. Well, they think the holograms are real and the humans are not real. And so basically what happens is that the Ming the Merciless type character, whose name was Chaotica, well, basically he goes to war with these aliens on the holodeck, and now Voyager's crew is like, well, now what are we supposed to do? So then they were able to rope Kate Mulgrew's Catherine Janeway into being the Bride of Chaotica to try and stop Chaotica and stop this war which is occurring in their holodeck, as well as convince these holographic aliens that no, this is all a simulation, none of this is real. It's a fun, like I said, it's a definitely throwback to the pulp TV serials of yesteryear, but it's fun, it's silly, and I remember when it aired and I enjoyed it. All right, so March 3rd, we have Deep Space Nine, Inter Arma Enim Silent Leagues, which I probably butchered that pronunciation. This involved Voyager on Deep Space Nine, not the Voyager, but instead another ship that's called an Intrepid class starship like Voyager is, because they figured, hey, we got all these sets from Voyager. Why don't we just, we can't do a crossover because Voyager is off in the Delta Quadrant, but why don't we use the sets and at least pretend like, like these guys are on a Voyager type of ship. It also has Section 31. Now, Section 31 is another controversial aspect of Star Trek. They are sort of a very clandestine organization. They operate in the shadows, and a lot of people felt that Section 31 is antithetical to Gene Roddenberry's vision of the future. So they had been appearing throughout Deep Space Nine. They had also appeared in Star Trek Enterprise, and for you Discovery fans, you would know that they also appeared in Star Trek Discovery, and there is a plan to eventually get Michelle Yeoh's character in Discovery to be the head of a Section 31 TV show. Oh, sorry. I'm not going to comment one way or the other on Section 31. They're a plot device. That's really all there is to it. I like I said, I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other, although I do agree that this is likely antithetical to Gene Roddenberry's vision of the future, but sometimes that's okay. Sorry. April 28th, we're now in season 7 of Deep Space Nine, by the way. Deep Space Nine, the changing face of evil. This had a really good battle sequence, but in the process, there went the Defiant. The Defiant got blowed up. Oh, goodbye, Defiant. Oh, you've served us so well these past few years. Of course, then like an episode or two later, they got in another Defiant class starship, but so they also called the Defiant. I don't know what the point was of blowing up the Defiant so late in the season. It was supposed to be like a shock moment. Maybe this was during sweeps week. I don't know. But anyway, it's such a low, it really didn't have much of an impact on the show, given a couple episodes later. Like I said, they had another Defiant class starship. Because they had to, because they had to reuse the footage that they'd already shot. Anyway, May 12th, Deep Space Nine, Tacking into the Wind. Oh, goodbye, sweet Gowron. Gowron had been introduced way back in Star Trek: The Next Generation. He basically became the chancellor of the Klingon people, and he had some crazy ideas about how to lead the Klingons, but by the end there, he was, the Worf came to the realization that he was not the leader the Klingon people needed. And so he put a stop to poor Gowron, and goodbye. And Robert O'Reilly played such a, like I said, unless you've seen who Gowron is, it's kind of hard to describe him, but he was definitely a wide-eyed character. And I will miss him. I also saw this episode when it aired too, as I recall. May 12th, we had Voyager Relativity. Basically, a character who had appeared in previous episodes of Voyager was a time traveler, and he was fed up with Voyager and wanted to blow them up. So basically, 7 of 9 had to travel through time in order to stop his temporal shenanigans. which is also the only time we ever saw Seven of Nine in a Starfleet outfit, from what I recall. I think this was like the only time that this happened. She went to Utopia Planitia, which is something we'd heard about multiple times throughout the Star Trek series. This is where above Mars, where they built all their ships. The Starfleet built a lot of their ships. So for me, again, as a Starship fan, first and foremost, this was, I'm like, oh yes, look at all these ships. There's an Akira class, there's a Steamrunner class, maybe there's a Saber class, there's a, there's Voyager before it, right when it launched. Anyway, so that was fun. We had May 25th, Voyager Warhead. Again, this episode is probably not high on most people's list, but again, this is my list, so I can talk about whatever I want. But anyway, this involves the Doctor finding a sentient warhead and trying to convince this warhead not to blow itself up and kill a bunch of innocent people. Because this warhead was at war with was basically programmed by one species to go attack another species. Well, the Doctor's like, you don't have to be a warhead, you can be more than a warhead. May 26th and September 22nd, we had Voyager Equinox Part 1 and 2 air. This was a finale from one season to the next. I believe this was season 5 going into season 6. Maybe? I might have that wrong. Well, anyway, Equinox was another Starfleet vessel that had been thrown into the Delta Quadrant by an alien called the Caretaker, who also took the crew of Voyager into the Delta Quadrant to dwell, while the crew of Voyager was relatively on the up and up and had largely emerged unscathed from most of their adventures in the Delta Quadrant. Well, the Equinox didn't have such good fortunes. Equinox was a much smaller ship. It was not designed for the long journey, and needless to say, they were in a bind. They were running out of supplies, running out of everything, and they had to do something very bad to then get warp power. And then now suddenly Captain Janeway and the captain of the Equinox, called Captain Ransom, are now at odds with each other. And again, I liked it because, again, I'm a Starship fan. It was fun to see another Starship vessel in Voyager. I wish Equinox hadn't been destroyed at the end, that they'd have both ships involved to do more stories. But again, the show is called Voyager, it's not called Voyager and Equinox. Now here's a sad one for our Deep Space Nine fans. What You Leave Behind. This was the final episode of Deep Space Nine. I did watch this when it aired, although I was a little confused because, again, I hadn't watched most of season 7. So I'm like, why is the main alien Dukat? He's supposed to be a Cardassian. Why is he now a Bajoran? And who on earth are the Pa Wraiths? But anyway, it was a good final finale. Again, had a great big starship battle. It was the end of the Dominion War. The Federation, the Klingons, and the Romulans, which that was fun to see all three of them working together, because usually one or all of them were at odds with each other at various points. But anyway, they retook Cardassia. Captain Sisko fulfilled his destiny as the emissary, and it ended. And like I said, I like Deep Space Nine. I really need to watch more of it. If my coworker said that she can start a Next Generation rewatch, then I need to do a Deep Space Nine rewatch. November 10th, we had Dragon Teeth from Voyager. Again, this is probably not an episode that's high on most people's lists, but I enjoyed it. Basically, Voyager actually encounters this this inner underspace, which allows them to travel through space through space faster. But then they end up finding this planet, which basically they realize that there are these aliens on it. Their planet's been destroyed by these other aliens. Well, they find out that the aliens on the planet that they landed on were actually the bad guys, and the ones that were in space were the good guys. And then they inadvertently ended up freeing some of the bad guy aliens. But given that this is Voyager and it wasn't episodic television, we never heard about the bad guy aliens again, although there was an interesting sequence which a lot of Star Trek continuity fans ponder, where this alien species that also the bad guys have been in cryogenic suspension for a long time. Well, they said that, oh, the Borg, you're a Borg? Man, when we were still around, the Borg had only conquered a handful of systems. So that's a continuity piece of the Borg that still puzzles people to this day. Anyway, November 17th, we had Voyager One Small Step, which was the graviton ellipse. Voyager encountered this graviton ellipse, which is sort of like a giant flying matzo ball or meatball flying through space. At least that's what it looked like to me. But anyway, they encounter it, and basically this graviton ellipse is sort of like the garbage. It's sort of like the garbage disposal, because everything that it encounters, it sucks into it and you can't get out. Well, Voyager figures out how to go in and out, and they actually, when they go into it just to see what's there, they find like a NASA ship in there. It was a NASA ship that was supposed to go from Earth to, I believe, one other planet in the solar system, Well, that ship ends up vanishing, and then they find it later on, and basically Seven of Nine is then tasked to recover the captain of this NASA ship, he's long since dead, but he recorded his logs, and Seven, she's like, well, why do humans care about the past? Well, as she listens to these logs, she gets an appreciation for the past. And the captain is played by Phil Morris, who was the son of Greg Morris from the original Mission Impossible. Phil Morris had appeared actually as a really young child in one of the original series episodes and appeared a handful of times since. But I thought he did a real good job in this episode as the captain of the NASA ship that had gotten captured by the graviton ellipse that he couldn't escape from. And so, yeah, I really like this episode. On November 24th, we had Voyager, the Voyager conspiracy. Seven of Nine seemingly loses her marbles and is convinced that Voyager was deliberately sent to the Delta Quadrant. And as sort of like, I can't remember what her logic was, but she basically came up with all these conspiracy theories. And then they realized what was wrong with Seven, and they were able to get her back on the up and up. But it was a fun episode. Like I said, I don't know how notable it is, but I enjoyed it. And then Deep Space, and finally, final thing of the year. This was the final episode that aired in 1999 on December 1st. We had Voyager Pathfinder. Reginald Barclay, who we talked about way back when in Next Generation, he was really fascinated by Voyager. Of course, Starfleet now knew that Voyager was now in the Delta Quadrant because of what had happened in Ship in a Bottle, but they had no way of reaching them. So Reginald Barclay, he basically stands up for himself, and he says, I'm going to find a way to contact Voyager. And even though Starfleet is like, no, this is never going to work, he sticks to his guns, and they're able to contact Voyager, and they're able to talk back and forth. And it's just like I said, it's a real good episode. I enjoyed it. And now that means that Voyager is no longer alone, because even though the Starfleet, the ships, they're never going to, it'd be a long time before Voyager is ever going to get back to the Alpha Quadrant. But now at least they can be in touch with home. Like I said, they're no longer alone. They're no longer alone. So, yeah. So what were the highlights of this season? Well, I would give it up to, as I said, the season finale of Deep Space Nine, What You Leave Behind. Again, I think the Deep Space Nine crew had another really good finale. So yeah, I'd watch that if you could. Of course, I'd also say watch all of the Deep Space Nine. And then the other highlight would have been, as I said, the episode from prior, which was One Small Step. Which again had a real good turn by Phil Morris as the captain of this NASA ship and what happened to him, and as well as Seven of Nine coming to an understanding about why the past is so important. So what are some suggested further reading for you? Here's just some examples of what's out there for stuff to learn more about these series, as well as Star Trek in general. The 50-year mission was a couple of books that came out for the 50th anniversary of Star Trek. It's, as it says, it's a complete, uncensored, unauthorized oral history of Star Trek. Basically uses like quotes from people, from cast, crew, and everyone else to sort of shape like how Star Trek was from year to year. The first book covers the first 25 years. The second book covers the second 25 years. And so it's good. It's a good insight into how things were at the time, as well as how people felt about Star Trek as it was airing. Of course, I talked about the Next Generation companion earlier. Goes through episode by episode, gives some, as it says, has a commentary from cast and crew. They did like 3 editions of this. The first one came out while the show was airing. The second one came out right after the show had finished airing. And then I believe they made a 3rd edition, which they did after all the movies were done. So that's a good one. And now if you're more of a book fan, if you want to know more about like the fiction books that came out from Star Trek, Voyages of the Imagination it's a really thick book, but it covers like the first 40 years of Star Trek novels. So it's a good way to read through them, learn more about what novels were made, and maybe you might find some plots that you might be interested in. And in addition to the books, it also has commentary from as many of the authors as they could contact to talk about the books that they had written. So it's a good insight into the books as well. But of course, what is the coolest Star Trek book ever made? And in my opinion, that goes to the Star Trek Encyclopedia. When I moved to Illinois, I was when I saw, I was like, I was in a new place. I didn't really, I was still meeting new people. But when I went to, and I still remember this all these years later, when I went to Sam's Club with my dad, I saw this on their book display. and I had to have this. This was like the coolest book I'd ever seen. This book was thick, it was huge, and it had everything Star Trek related that you could possibly imagine up until, you know, you said actually, I think this, I can't remember if this covered the season 7 or not, but it definitely covered up to season 6 of Star Trek: The Next Generation, and the first couple seasons of Deep Space Nine. But anyway, I had to have this, and my parents bought it for me, and to this day, I still own this book all these years later. And it's a little worn, but like I said, this book, I mean, like I said, this is definitely this is definitely my favorite Star Trek book ever made. I had no shame in admitting that statement. All right, so in conclusion, I love the 90s. We all love the 90s. Star Trek was a wonderful time for the 90s. And if you haven't revisited Star Trek in the 90s, by all means do, but just know that from 1966 to even to today, Star Trek is still going strong. And with that, I will end today's presentation. Thank you everybody for coming out here today or watching this, whether you watched it for the live presentation that I gave earlier this week, or if you're just watching this recording for you, if you came to the presentation, this is your first time experiencing this. My name is Omar Kashad. I'm one of the Adult Services Librarians at the Carroll Stream Public Library. Live long and prosper. And remember, space is the final frontier.